Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Stel Space. I am your host, Stel, and we are out here again in a little bit of an overcast Tampa Bay again, third week in a row where we're overcast. We got a little bit of rainy weather. It is the summer. It's the summer. We got some rain to expect throughout the summer months. Which is not a bad thing. We do need the rain. We do need this rain. But it is currently 86 degrees outside with a high of 88. So not too hot on a temperature scale. Not too bad out there, but it is pretty humid with this rain that we've been getting. It's let's see, like a 85% humidity out there. Pretty hot, pretty humid. Uh, Humidity should go down throughout the day, but of course, with some rain, it's still going to be pretty moist out there. But today, I have a couple of things to go through. This week, I have watched the 2004 film Troy, which, goes off of last week's breakdown of the Odyssey, keeping things in line for our Iliad and Odyssey breakdown. But after our breakdown of Troy, we will be talking again about House of the Dragon. This week, we got episode 6. Another good episode, in my opinion. And as well as we'll be covering, I guess this whole episode's basically media I've watched this week, but for our last segment, we will be covering some albums I listened to this week. I listened to a couple Lana Del Rey albums in, preparation for her announced 2 albums, hopefully coming out in the near future. But that leaves us off to a breakdown of Troy, 2004, directed by Wolfgang Petersen. Not a bad movie. It's written by Jump Scare David Benioff. Famously directed or wrote and directed, was a big player in the hand of the original TV series of Game of Thrones. Very interesting to see another piece of work of his, this time in Troy, adapting the Iliad. Let's see, throughout the movie we have Brad Pitt playing Achilles, we have Orlando Bloom playing Paris, and playing his brother of Hector, we have Eric Bana, and playing King Agamemnon, we have Brian Cox. King Odysseus is played by Sean Bean, great actor there, with King Menelaus played by Brendan Gleeson. We have Helen of Troy played by Diane Kruger. And we have Briseis played by Rose Byrne. Rose Byrne, what a fun little couple years of work she had throughout the early 2000s with, 2004 she did Troy, 2006 she did Marie Antoinette, a favorite movie of mine. But we also have Patroclus played by Garrett Hedlund, which another favorite actor of mine. He plays in a very good movie based on the book, and the movie has the same title. On the Road, another very good movie, but we're not here to talk about On the Road. I was just surprised to see Garrett Hedlund in this film, to be honest. But just like the Odyssey, this film of Troy just pretty much disregards the gods throughout the film. We're going for a more realistic take on the story, which of course can be very interesting, brings a little bit into conversation, like, mm, maybe just bringing more like a historical accurate view on like the story of the Iliad, where we're just gonna like ignore the gods. They still believe in the gods. They might think the gods have a big hand in the events to come in the story, as they very much do in the book. But, however, unlike the Odyssey that we covered last week, I very much enjoyed dialogue throughout this film. Again, it is written by David Benioff, who, in my opinion, did a pretty well job adapting the first three, four books, however you want to say, in Game of Thrones. So, we are very well aware that he has a pretty well written hand when it comes to dialogue and storytelling. But, oftentimes the dialogue can be cringe, but, I say to be cringe is to be free. I'll take all the dialogue I can get. In my opinion, there was not enough dialogue in the Odyssey. you know, can't get more writers into there. But to open up our film of Troy, we have a battle scene setting up characters like King Agamemnon and his brother King Menelaus, as well as a very well known fighter of Achilles, which we see Achilles being a very dependable fighter in the war, as he takes down a very large warrior with his single signature move that we will see throughout this film, which I thought was pretty funny. But can't complain, it was a pretty cool move that he does pull off. But because this film goes for a more modern take of the story, Agamemnon is more of a conqueror, trying to expand his power, which leads us to a scene in Sparta, where the Greeks and the Trojans are celebrating a peace treaty, which, again, is all for our modern audience. Our modern brains, we have to understand why these kings are doing the things they are doing in this story. Whereas in the books, the Trojan War is more, we just got to get Helen back to Greece, which is a very important thing for the story. But in Sparta, we do see that Paris is having an affair with the wife of Menelaus, Helen. And allegedly, the director didn't really want to cast Helen because he felt it would have been very hard to cast a person who is supposed to be the most beautiful woman in the world. I definitely understand where he's coming from, but I also take it as a little backhanded compliment for the person he did end up casting. Wouldn't really want to be in her position. It's a very big role to fill there. But I think she did a very well job. To continue our story, though, we have Paris's brother Hector catching on to this affair between Paris and Helen pretty quickly and discussing the severity of the situation his brother has put them in, especially since they are now taking Helen out of Sparta to now have Helen of Troy. And with this, we have Menelaus and Agamemnon discussing war with Troy. For this original story, again, we have, we purely want to get Helen back to Troy. But of course, for modern audiences, we do want to see a bit of Greek expansion, I suppose. It definitely helps to wrap our head around the characters' choices they make, especially with Agamemnon, being a little bit more power hungry, he wants to expand Greece into Troy, which again would be in modern day Turkey, across the Mediterranean Sea. But we are then shown Achilles and Patroclus training for battle. We have a very well-known warrior, Achilles, training his cousin. They are very adamant at making it very well known that they are cousins and not lovers, even though historically they are both cousins and lovers in the text, but whatever. But we are shown that maybe Achilles and Agamemnon have a rift between them as they fight over Briseis. But, that's just very oversimplifying this not too complicated story, but, we're going to keep it very simple for time being. And because we are keeping things very simplified, we're jumping right into the war. The Greeks basically spawn at Troy. They cross the Mediterranean Sea very quickly and, get to the walls of Troy with the Greeks at Troy's door. Paris goes out to fight Menelaus, but very quickly flees away from King Menelaus as he takes a couple pretty strong hits. Understandably, he's afraid to die. But with that fleeing, we do have the true start off to the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And I almost forgot. For the story, we do have Hector killing Menelaus, defending his brother Paris, which, you know what? Yeah, well, just move the story on for let's just do this for fun, I guess. Okay, but oh, and also, Odysseus is also in this movie. For Yeah, he's in this movie for reasons we do know why he's in this movie. We'll get to that later, but he's in this movie for reasons. He just pops up very randomly, in my opinion, for this story. But we'll jump back to Hector fighting in another battle. He thinks that he is fighting Achilles, but it's actually Patroclus dressed as Achilles, unfortunately. And unfortunately, he does take down Patroclus, which leads to another battle between Achilles now and Hector, which of course ends in the death of Hector. A very well done battle sequence between these two men, and ending in a very disrespectful act by Achilles when he drags the dead body of Hector. In the original text, he does it around Troy a couple times before dragging his body to the Greek camp. But, for time's sake, he just takes him straight to the Greek camp. Still very disrespectful act. But we get a very well done scene between the father of Hector, Priam, to retrieve Hector's body and give him a proper burial. With that, Achilles is telling Priam that the Greeks will not attack Troy for 12 days. Pretty noble act with that. But, of course, with that, we get a little bit of planning by the Greeks, of course, with their very well-known act of creating the Trojan horse to take down the city of Troy, which is, of course, exactly what they do. And unfortunately for us, we are missed out on one of my favorite characters, Cassandra. Nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be found in this story. Again, for whatever reason, we can't have a prophetic person because that would be so unrealistic in a story about gods and whatever. But, you know, I just have a few things to say. Cassandra, very interesting character. Very good song written by Taylor Swift, a favorite artist of mine. You know, as she says, so they killed Cassandra first because she feared the worst and tried to tell the town, which is quite literally exactly what she does. Cassandra is a very interesting character who is cursed by the god Apollo to have prophetic visions. Although, with those prophetic visions, the people around her will never believe her visions to be true, which is just a very classic, tragic Greek character that we do miss out on in this story. But of course, you know, we have our fighting continuing in the city of Troy. And we have Briseis killing Agamemnon, which is a choice, you know, for the film. Yeah, it's a choice. But, you know, we gotta tie things up. We gotta finish our story in a smooth manner. But we have Paris shooting Achilles in his Achilles. And then, you know, a few more times just for fun. But, you know, we end the movie with Paris and Briseis fleeing Troy. And overall, a very entertaining film, of course, with very interesting choices made to simplify the story, which, you know, to be fair, they did need to simplify the story to fit it into a 3-hour film. Under 3 hours if you watch the theatrical version. In my opinion, very hard to find that theatrical version. You might just so happen to get stuck watching the director's cut. Not a bad not a bad cut by any means. They do, however, change the score for whatever reason for the director's cut. Interesting choices, but that leads us into our break, and we will be taking a quick break, and we will be back shortly. And we are back. We are back in Stel space. And again, I am your host, Stel. Surprisingly, you know, if you couldn't guess that. But we're back with a bit of House of the Dragon. We got episode 6 last Sunday. This episode, interestingly, is titled Faceless Men. Can't say we necessarily saw faceless men in this episode of, you know, faceless men that we are familiar with from the continent of Essos. You know, they're from the city of Bravos, but, you know, we're not necessarily here to talk about that. I'm just interested in their title there. What are they thinking with that one? You know, I guess maybe we'll come to some conclusions there. But we have a great opening with Christian Cole walking right into the Tully army trap. We have the Tully army with the northern army of the Winter Wolves from just the northern portion of Westeros, I suppose. I guess they're all over. I was just going to say they're from Winterfell, but that's not, I wouldn't, you know, necessarily say that's entirely true. I'd imagine they're from all over the northern part of the continent. But a very great opening with the falling of Kristen Cole. We have, the Tully army setting up a trap of making it seem like there was a battle there. Kristen Cole and his men walking right up to them and them springing right up from the ground and attacking Kristen Cole and his men so that the Tully army could completely surround them and just take out this character, the character of the Kingmaker. He was a very big hand in getting Aegon Targaryen on the throne in this story earlier in the show. And we have Kristen Cole killed by a character who, really hasn't been on screen yet, hasn't been introduced to us on screen yet. I have mixed emotions about that one. I wish they would introduce people, especially if they're gonna have a big role like this. And it just feels kind of out of place, in my opinion. But, the writers making changes for the show. Some changes hits, some changes misses, in my opinion. But in the Red Keep, we have Alicent and Helena being found by Queen Rhaenyra's Queensguard. Very quickly, they didn't try, in my opinion, too hard in escaping the Red Keep. They, seems like they just sat down very quickly, losing a little bit of agency with that one, unfortunately. And continuing in the Red Keep, we have Daemon and Rhaenyra continuing to butt heads in another council meeting, both maintaining their positions. We have Daemon wanting to show his family's strength of, they have all of these dragons on their sides. Obviously, or maybe not so obviously to some people, because, Rhaenyra's struggling still unwrapping her brain around this concept. But we have Rhaenyra continuing her position of sending swords in place of dragons to get people to kneel. Which again, would be a whole lot easier if we just sent a dragon to instill fear, get people on your side by making them fear you. Unfortunately for them. But Rhaenyra's trying to be a little bit like her father, leave the dragons out of it a bit, but we will see how that all plays out in the weeks to come. But outside of Tumbleton, we have the Dragon Seeds, Ulf and Hugh, discussing their position as dragon riders and knights of the Seven Kingdom, with Ulf making some good points about losing a lot of their freedom with their newfound power in being knights. They are being told that they must stay in the Red Keep for the entire time. They don't get to go out and have their fun. They don't get to go out and drink with their friends like they used to, unfortunately, because they are very important people in this war. And in the Red Keep still, we have Alicent and Rhaenyra having another discussion, but this time they are discussing Helena's pregnancy. Of course, we have Rhaenyra catching Alicent and Helena trying to escape from last episode. She's questioning why, in Rhaenyra's opinion, she's being very kind to her friend who is her enemy, Alicent, and, keeping them safe in a very nice bedroom, allowing them to get fresh air still in the God's woods. But of course, it's not exactly the best place to be in for Helena. She's going through a lot right now. But down in Flea Bottom, we have the City Watch resigning from their positions since, many City Watch members have been recently murdered by the Green Targaryens, the Targaryens that work with the Hightower family. Which, understandably so, they don't necessarily want to work. They're not getting paid right now. They don't want to be killed. They have families to look after. They have themselves to look after. But unfortunately, that leaves us with the city no longer having a pretty good not good force. They're pretty violent force. But they get the job done, I suppose. And we're left with Damon continuing his investigation in Flea Bottom. But over in Harrenhal, we have Alice Rivers continuing her ploy to win over Aemond Targaryen's favor, and seemingly playing out into her favor because, it seems to be working. She seems to be getting Aemond on her side, but that we will see again in the weeks to come. I don't want to get into things that we will be talking about, maybe next week, maybe the week afterwards. And in the Eyrie, we have Rhaena Targaryen allegedly trying to contact her sister Baela as she sees her dragon moondancer flying over a nearby town. And we have Lady Jane Eyre very concerned with anything that Rhaena does. She doesn't want to get caught being a part, having a hand in anything Rhaena does, especially since Rhaenyra has very high suspicions that the person who rides Sheep Stealer had a very big hand in the death of the heir to the throne of Jacaerys Targaryen. You know, some things that bother me about this show, I don't fully understand how Jane Eyre has the full knowledge of the things she knows. We have things with her. Like, why does she instantly know that Jacaerys Targaryen falls in the Battle of the Gullet, like, very, very shortly after the battle? Like, why? How? How would she know that? Like, in what world would she know that? She's so far away from the battle. It's just beyond me. And again, in this episode, she's just given information to have conflict with Rhaena, and that's just a big change that's bothering me. But, moving away from that, back in Tumbleton, we see Ormond continuing to be an overall bad person, with him using Daeron's name for his own benefit and belittling his cousin Gwaine. And we see that Gwaine and Daeron have, a bit of a friendly relationship. They are, I believe, no, actually, they're not half siblings. Daeron is Gwaine's nephew, as Gwaine is Alicent Hightower's sister. And we have them discussing their shared dislike of Ormond as he pulls out the worst in them. And back in the Red Keep, we have Daeron's sister, Helena. You know, poor Helena, poor Helena. She knows exactly when her mother is lying to her. As we see in this scene, she's just not exactly believing all that Allison has to say anymore. Allison's just trying to cover herself. She's trying to make things as best as she can. You know, of course, in the position that she has put herself, as she had a very big hand in starting this war, this civil war between the Targaryen family, you know, the Targaryens, with King Aegon and Queen Rhaenyra, who are half siblings as well. And, you know, pulling it back to Greek mythology, Helena has a little bit of a similarity to a character we talked about earlier with Cassandra. You know, she has these premonitions. Luckily for Helena, she is believed by her people around, the family around her. She's believed by Allison. She's believed by her brother Aemond. When last season we're shown Helena and Aemon discussing visions that Helena has seen in the case of the falling of her brother. But, you know, I love that little, you know, bringing in a little bit of Greek mythology into this story. And I like how it ties into other things that are coming out at the same time, you know, especially since the Odyssey just came out earlier this month. And back in Harrenhal, we have Alice Rivers revealing that she has 6 dragon eggs for whatever reason. You know, Targaryens have spent a good amount of time in Harrenhal. And we see, you know, just so maybe that Alice Rivers might be getting Aemon Targaryen just in her grasp, you know, under her wing with the plans she has. And back in King's Landing, we might be seeing a little bit of Rhaenyra the Cruel, as she is talking to a good amount of petitioners again. We get another scene with her petitioning, or people, you know, her people petitioning to her their issues they have in her city. And we see that the Iron Throne maybe isn't agreeing with her so much as she gets a cut on her hand. And maybe the gods aren't deciding that she's the rightful heir. You know, very interesting stuff we got going on. We see her looking at a statue of her father Viserys and her standing right up from that throne. She's not having any of that. She's gonna, you know, clear her mind a bit. But back with Daemon, we have him catching a Hightower loyalist who had a very big hand in killing the City Watch, and with Daemon doing that, we have him also running into the Dragon Seed Ulf. Unfortunate for Ulf, because he is supposed to be in the Red Keep at all times, as mentioned earlier. And we get a little bit of a tussle between Daemon putting Ulf maybe in his place, maybe stepping a bit over line. We do need Ulf again. Remember, we need the dragon seeds on our side to benefit our position of power. And to continue our talk with the dragon seeds, we also see that Hugh sneaks into Tumbleton to find his wife, Kat, who thankfully gives him a huge welcome call that he very much needed. You know, he went out and found all of this power for himself. His wife very much so did not ask to be left alone in a time of need. Last season, we did see them lose their daughter. Very hard stuff for a mother, very hard stuff for a father, of course, you know, and we see them taking very different routes with that grief. And in Tumbleton still, we see a host of Baratheon men showing up, you know, to meet with Ormond. But maybe Rhaenyra took a page out of Ormond's book and maybe she sent in people disguised as Baratheon men. Interestingly, they are very smelly, which, as we do know, Ormond is not a fan of that whatsoever. So, you know, maybe that was a little bit of behind the scenes action by Rhaenyra and Massaria. Can't complain there. A very interesting scene. And in another scene with Alicent and Rhaenyra, we have Alicent explaining that to Rhaenyra that her daughter is a Targaryen dreamer, which might have a hand in Rhaenyra sending Alicent away to Harrenhal to do some things that Alicent doesn't want to do. But that leaves space for Rhaenyra to maybe get Helena to be on her side, which, you know, definitely makes sense. It definitely makes sense why Rhaenyra would want Helena to tell her any pathetic dreams she has, maybe putting her in a better position as she would have the upper hand in being able to see the future. You know, but with Alicent being sent to Harrenhal, we have Rhaenyra commanding her to kill her son. Obviously, Alicent does not want to kill her own son. We'll see how that plays off. I can't complain anytime Olivia Cooke is on screen. She kills this role so well. Lots of acting going on in this show. But of course, we have Alicent reminding the queen that her position of power already pushes her to be a ruler that she doesn't want us to be. And ending our episode, we see the hand of the queen, Corlys, getting ambushed by the Hightower army now, and possibly dying. Unfortunately for us, as we are now losing another very well played character of Corlys, played by Steve Dusant. You know, he will be missed. He will be missed in this show. But that leaves us off of our House of the Dragon episode 6 breakdown, and we will be taking another bit of a break, and we will be back in a few minutes. And welcome back to Stel Space. Again, I am your host, Stel. And for our last segment for the day, we have I did talk about, obviously, media I watched throughout this week. You know, we covered Troy from 2004. We covered House of the Dragon episode 6. And now we're going to talk about some albums I listened to this week. This week, I listened to 3 Lana Del Rey albums. Starting us off, I listened to her most recent album that came out in 2023. Her album of Did You Know That There's a Tunnel Under Ocean Boulevard? A very, very well done album, in my opinion. But, in my opinion, every album she does is very well done. But, of course, this album is a bit of a slower one. Has a good amount of slow songs on it, but she does have a good amount of upbeat moments placed throughout the album, which brings in a bit of fun into the darkness, or a little bit of light into the darkness, as that's, a recurring theme talked about throughout this album. And I absolutely love what she has to say about family and dealing with loss and grief when losing family members or loved ones, and how their memory lives on through her in songs like The Grants, which is entitled after her last name from her father, obviously. And we have lines like from The Grants, like, when you leave, all you take is your memories, and I'm going to take mine of you with me. Very beautiful saying, in my opinion. And of course, probably the most talked about song off of the album, the 7-minute track of A and W, a very, very interesting song. Of course, the song starts off on a serious note, recalling events that make up a large part of her image. That image that goes back all the way to her debut album. Think Americana vibes, think getting picked up by a biker gang at a gas station and riding their motorcycles across the country with them. Very freedom-esque, Americana again, lots of nice imagery there. And this song plays into that. And then this song takes a very big turn in going, back to, again, her debut album, with completely switching up the song from a slow ballad-like song where she's definitely telling a story throughout, to then change it to a more trap beat, hip-hop beat that is very Born to Die-esque, her debut album, which is, very fun to see, and honestly, along the lines of exactly what she does in her music. She likes to switch things up in her songs, throughout her career. And she continues this thought of loss in songs like this very beautiful song called Kintsugi, where she contemplates different forms of loss she's faced with the death of family members or heartbreaks from past lovers, and how those cracks are able to allow light to shine in. And of course, the title of Kintsugi comes from the Japanese art form of embracing something broken and repairing it with a golden colored adhesive, to very simply say how they repair these broken pieces of art. And she's taking this in a very literal sense of, there's these lines of golden light through the crack of, imagine a broken porcelain bowl. We see that it has been damaged, and we are now seeing how that damage allows light to shine in. And Right off of that song, we get a 5-minute stream of consciousness in the song Fingertips, where she starts off thinking about her family. She's asking her brother to stop smoking. She's asking if her sister's going to be there with her. She's asking if her niece is going to be all right. She's wondering if she's going to have a child of her own and wondering if she's even able to handle having a child of her own. She's mentioning medications she may be on or may have been on previously, saying that it wasn't her idea. The cocktail of things that twist neurons inside of her mind, saying that without them, she'd die. Which is a very sad thought. And she continues in the song saying that people like to say that there's a lot of irony and there's a lot of tragedy in her songs. And since they are her songs, they are representations of her life, she doesn't see her life experiences as a Greek tragedy. And again, pulling into this idea of letting the light shine in, she just needs to let the light shine in, and people don't necessarily allow that light to shine in. Whereas she can recognize that, yeah, she can be sad and she allows herself to cry, but then that gives her space to grow into a happier person. And one of my favorite songs off of the album, again, playing into this idea of letting the light shine in, we have the song titled Let the Light In, featuring Father John Misty, where she is changing this idea of letting the light shine in through, a broken heart and like repairing a broken heart, whereas now we're taking let the light shine in a more literal sense of opening a door to let the light shine into a dark room, where the song is allegedly covering a love affair between a bandmate and maybe a fan, maybe somebody who works in the industry, not entirely sure, but a very well done song. And that leads us off to a conversation about the title of the album itself, where people do like to make fun of this album title of Did You Know That There's a Tunnel Under Ocean Boulevard? They like to make fun that Lana likes to make these very long-winded titles. But with this title, in my opinion, it's showing us like very much what this album's about. This album's about family and how your memories are passed through family and their history being passed through your family. And she's asking, did you know that there's a tunnel under Ocean Boulevard? Because a lot of people might not know that. But, maybe people from her family might have known that and passed that knowledge throughout the generations to come after them. A very simple thought and a very well done, very well executed thought. And that brings us into our second album, which I do have a lot less to say about because, in my opinion, a lot of people do talk about this album. Not that people didn't talk about her most recent album, but we have Norman effing Rockwell, released in 2019, a very highly successful album. You know, probably her most successful album at this point. And I honestly don't have much to say about the album. Obviously, a very well done album, has very, very good songs on it. No skips, honestly. But again, she's a no skips album kind of artist in general. And that brings us into her 2017 album of Lust for Life. This album was very big for me at the time it came out. I was a senior in high school in 2017. Also in 2017, we had things like the first Trump presidency, where this album very much so is commentating on the state of America at the time, and it's honestly very nice to get that commentation from a very well known artist like Lana Del Rey. And listening to this album after 2020, we had a pretty big thing happening in 2020. If you guys missed that one, I don't know about that. It's very interesting to listen to an album released in 2017 after like very worldwide large events like a worldwide pandemic, where that pandemic had a very large hand in spreading right-wing media, unfortunately, and getting it all over the internet as we were all inside on our phones online at that time. And it's very interesting to see a large artist talking about some things like that before events like that happened. But, that leads us off of our show. Obviously, I'm very much excited for the next two albums that are coming out by Lana Del Rey. Hopefully, we will get some release dates with that soon. But I will be leaving us here. Thank you so much for listening to Stel Space. It has been a pleasure hosting you guys, and I will see you again next Tuesday at 11 a.m. I will see you then.